Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a really big topic, the rise and fall of world powers.
Yeah, it's huge. And our main guide for this is Ray Dalio's book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
Right, so our mission here really is to pull out the core patterns Dalio sees in these massive global shifts.
Think of it as getting the essentials on how power dynamics change over long periods. We want to give you that historical context for what's happening now and maybe, what could happen next.
It's about getting that deeper understanding quickly without getting bogged down in, every single detail.
Exactly. Distilling the knowledge, not just listing facts. Dalio actually talks about bolding key ideas in his book so you can grasp them fast.
Oh, okay. Like a built-in summary.
Sort of, yeah. And that's kind of our approach today, focusing on those core insights from his analysis of empires, those repeating cycles.
Growth, peak, decline, the whole thing.
What makes his approach interesting is viewing history through these defined life cycles, looking for those cause and effect links that keep cropping up.
Okay, let's get into it then. This big cycle, he describes, what's a basic rhythm we need to understand?
Well, at its core, it seems to swing between two main types of periods.
Okay.
First, you get these long stretches, relatively speaking, of peace and prosperity. Times of creativity, productivity, living standards generally go up.
The good times, basically.
Yeah, the good times. But then second, you have these other periods. They tend to be shorter, but much more intense. Think depression, revolution, war, major upheaval, struggles over wealth, over power.
And the lengths are quite different, you mentioned.
Very different. The peaceful, productive phases usually last much, much longer, maybe 5 times longer than the turbulent phases, roughly.
5 to 1. Wow, that's a big difference.
It really is, and it's a key point,
Yeah.
because it means those really rough patches, while incredibly impactful, are statistically less common over the grand sweep of history.
Which means if you're living through a calm period, you might forget the messy parts are even possible.
Exactly. Complacency sets in. People forget that these dramatic shifts are actually part of the historical norm. So understanding that long-term cycle helps avoid being completely blindsided.
Yeah, because the future might hold things we just haven't seen in our own adult lives.
Precisely. These swings happen over generations. Dalio uses the example of, say, someone who only knew the boom after World War II. How could they really imagine the sheer hardship of the Great Depression?
Or maybe for us today, living in an era that feels very driven by debt. It's hard to picture what a major downturn or conflict really looks like up close.
Right, and he connects that to how money itself has changed, moving away from being backed by, gold or something physical.
To fiat currency.
Yeah, fiat money. Money based on government decree and, faith. That's definitely made it easier to borrow on a massive scale.
But history suggests that's often preceded trouble.
The pattern seems to be that these big debt-fueled expansions often come before periods of, let's say, significant pain, economic pain, social unrest. So learning from those past cycles is pretty vital if we want to avoid making the same mistakes.
He mentions his own experience back in 1971, right? Seeing unexpected global events totally shake up the markets.
Yeah, Nixon decoupling the dollar from gold, it clearly made a huge impression on him, reinforcing this idea that you need to understand these deeper, longer-term forces.
So to track these big shifts, he developed this index of the total power of empires. What is that, essentially?
Think of it like a combined score. He takes various measures, economic strength, military power, technology, education, things like that, and bundles them together into one overall index to sort of gauge the relative power of different nations across history. It gives you that big picture comparison.
And what's driving the ups and downs on that index?
He's identified 18 key factors, or determinants, as he calls them. These are the underlying forces he believes shape the rise and fall. We probably won't dig into all 18 today. But just knowing he sees these specific drivers as fundamental is important.
And he highlights 3 main cycles within that broader picture.
Yes, 3 that are really interconnected and crucial. First, the long-term debt and capital market cycle. That's your financial booms and busts.
Yeah.
Second, the internal order and disorder cycle. That's about social cohesion, political stability, or conflict within a country.
Okay, internal dynamics.
And third, the external order and disorder cycle. That looks at the relationships between countries, alliances, rivalries, global power balance.
So how do they interact? Is it like Debt causes internal problems, which then spills over internationally.
That's a good way to think about it. The debt cycle often creates the financial stress. The internal cycle determines how well a nation handles that stress. Does it pull together or fall apart? And the external cycle reflects how those internal situations play out globally, especially in relation to other rising or declining powers.
Makes sense. Let's zoom in on a few of those 18 determinants then. Which ones really stand out as critical for success or failure?
Well, one he really emphasizes is the ability to learn from history.
Okay, that sounds fundamental.
It is. He argues that just relying on your own short lifespan isn't enough. Big shocks happen that are totally outside your personal experience.
Right, like we were saying.
Exactly. He points to China, for instance, as a culture that, historically at least, has put a huge emphasis on learning from its very long past. And this ties right back to what you, the listener, want, that quick but deep understanding. History is this massive database of lessons learned, sometimes the hard way.
Broadening the perspective beyond just me. What else?
Education and character. This is huge, not just teaching facts, but developing, character, civility, work ethic. He argues this is what really fuels innovation and productivity long term.
So it's not just smarts, but also how society functions.
Right. It's how you go from making basic stuff to inventing new technologies. He mentions the Dutch Republic back in its Yarden Age as an example of that inventiveness tied to their system.
Interesting. Values and intellect driving progress.
Then there's a raw drive to gain and keep wealth and power. It's a powerful motivator, obviously.
Sure.
But the key for long-term success, he stresses, is simple. You've got to earn at least as much as you spend. Sounds basic, right? But nations that consistently run big deficits eventually run into trouble.
National Bookkeeping 101.
Pretty much. Another critical one, capital markets. Having efficient ways for people to save money and for businesses to get investment capital is just essential for economic health.
Makes sense. And what about divisions within society?
Yeah, class struggles. He sees some level of sorting into classes as pretty inherent, but he observes that harmony tends to be higher earlier in the cycle, later on, especially when times get tough.
Divisions widen.
They tend to deepen,
Yeah.
leading to more conflict. He actually suggests you think about where you see yourself in that structure and how those feelings might change when things get tense.
That's a provocative thought. And politics. Left versus right.
That's another determinant, the political left-right cycle. He talks about the classic tension between, broadly speaking, more capitalist approaches and more socialist ones.
Right.
And how the battles between these ideas really shape economies, markets, who gets wealthy, and ultimately national power. And he notes these kinds of conflicts exist in different forms of government, not just democracies.
So it's this really complex mix of forces inside and outside a country. Let's trace the typical path then. What does the rise phase look like?
Typically, it starts with strong, capable leadership putting a good system in place, a system that generates wealth and power effectively. Often, like we said, emphasizing education, character development.
Okay, building a solid foundation.
Exactly. That fuels innovation, makes the country more open to ideas from elsewhere, fosters collaboration between workers, government, military, all leading to higher productivity, becoming more competitive globally, grabbing a bigger slice of world trade.
Like a virtuous cycle kicking in. And the peak. What are the signs of nations at the top?
Usually, living standards are way higher than in the past. You see sophisticated financial markets develop. Often, the country's currency becomes the world's reserve currency. That's a huge advantage, the exorbitant privilege.
This is pretty good, but there's a catch.
There often is. That very success can breed complacency and excess. Maybe too much debt builds up, maybe inequality widens too much. The seeds of the potential decline can be sown right at the peak.
Okay, so what are the warning signs then? How do you know a decline might be starting?
You start seeing several things. Debt becomes a major problem. The gap between rich and poor gets really wide, politically charged. Often you see declines in educational standards, maybe changes in social values or work ethic.
Less productive, maybe.
Yeah, the country starts consuming more than it produces, losing its competitive edge. And internally, conflicts heat up rich versus poor, left versus right, maybe anti-capitalist sentiment grows. People with money start moving it elsewhere.
Sounds like internal stress is building.
A lot of it. And at the same time, externally, rivals' other rising powers start to challenge the dominant nation more openly.
So pressure from both inside and out. How bad can the internal conflicts get?
Potentially leading to revolution or even civil war. a complete reset of the internal order. And externally, those rising powers often try to exploit the leader's internal weaknesses. This can lead to international conflicts, very expensive military spending,
Forcing tough choices.
really tough choices for the leading power, fight these challenges, which is costly and risky, or retreat, which means losing influence. And a really critical moment is often when other countries lose faith in the leader's currency and its ability to pay its debts.
That loss of faith in the reserve currency sounds like a major turning point.
It usually is. It signals a deep erosion of power.
You mentioned the interplay between internal and external order. How do they feed off each other?
Well, they're both constantly shifting because of that fundamental struggle for wealth and power. Dalio lays out stages for internal order, too. You have conflict, then a new order is established, systems are built, peace and prosperity for a while.
Then the problems start.
Then excesses build up, financial conditions worsen, conflict increases, potentially leading to civil war revolution, and then you're back to establishing a new order.
A cycle within the cycle.
Kind of. And these internal shifts can happen without totally upending the global order. But when major internal turmoil coincides with big external challenges from rising towers, that's when the whole world order can get reshaped.
Let's talk more about the role of money, debt, and credit in all this. What's the key thing to grasp?
The absolute key is knowing the difference between real wealth, actual stuff, services, things people want, and financial wealth, which is basically claims on future income or assets you hope to sell later.
Okay, stuff versus paper.
Essentially, real wealth comes from being productive. Now, typically, when a nation is rising, people save, they're maybe more cautious. But as time goes on, generations forget the harder times.
And they start spending more, borrowing more.
Exactly. That memory of insecurity fades. So spending increases, debt piles up, money and credit creation fuel this. They boost spending power, push asset prices up.
But it creates future obligations.
Right. Someone has to pay it back. Central banks try to manage this whole cycle, fiddling with interest rates, controlling how much money and credit is available.
But that control isn't unlimited.
No. The long-term debt cycle reaches a kind of endpoint when the central bank's actions stop having much effect on the real economy, when more debt doesn't create real growth anymore.
What happens then?
People start wanting to get out of holding that debt. They want to swap it for other things, gold, commodities, maybe assets in other countries. And that can force a restructuring of the whole money system.
And printing money fits in how? Is that a way out?
It can look like one, temporarily. Printing money to buy up debt, monetizing the debt can seem like it solves the problem. But ultimately, the cost gets pushed onto the population, usually through inflation or the currency losing value.
So it's not a free lunch.
Definitely not. Dalio also quickly touches on the different types of money systems throughout history.
Yeah.
You know, hard money, like gold, then paper claims on that gold, and now mostly fiat money.
And fiat is more volatile.
Historically, yes. Fiat systems tend to be more prone to big inflations or devaluations happening episodically.
Okay, bringing this right up to today.
Yeah.
Using Dalio's framework from the book, where does he see the U.S. and China in this big cycle?
Well, based on his metrics in the book, he positions the U.S. as being in that later stage facing significant financial challenges, rising internal conflict, still very powerful in many ways, of course, especially militarily and technologically, but relatively speaking, seeing some decline in its overall strength indicator.
And China.
Generally seen as being on the rising part of the cycle, gaining economic power, expanding influence, developing technology rapidly.
And he talks about wars already happening between them, even if not, shooting wars.
Right. He identifies several fronts. There's the trade economic war, tariffs, restrictions, that sort of thing. The technology war, a race for dominance in AI, semiconductors, 5G, etc.
We hear a lot about that one.
Yeah. Then the capital war, the potential for restrictions on investment flows, even asset freezes, and the geopolitical war, competing for influence, allies, shaping international institutions.
So conflict on multiple levels, intensifying, but not yet military.
That seems to be his assessment, and he really stresses how different their perspectives and decision-making processes are, just based on their vastly different histories and cultures.
Which increases the risk of misunderstanding.
Hugely. The risk of miscalculation leading to unintended escalation is significant, especially, he notes, because historically, declining powers sometimes tend to become bigger risk takers, more inclined to fight to maintain their position.
And Taiwan is mentioned as a specific flashpoint.
Yes, it's highlighted as a major potential area where tensions could boil over.
Looking forward then, What other major factors does Dalio flag for the future within this cycle framework?
He definitely points to the accelerating pace of technology, especially things like AI and computing thinking technologies. How will that change productivity, power dynamics? It's a huge question.
For sure.
He also emphasizes watching the debt burden closely. It's like a gauge for potential future trouble with the value of money and bonds.
And the internal divisions in the U.S.
He flags that as being at levels not seen since maybe the 1960s or even earlier, which is obviously a major concern for stability. And similarly, the external conflict level between the U.S. and China is measured as being significantly elevated, like one standard deviation above the historical norm in his data.
Are other big forces mentioned, like environmental changes?
Yes, he does briefly include acts of nature, specifically mentioning climate change, rising temperatures, CO2 levels as an increasingly important factor impacting countries and the global system.
And he directs people somewhere for more data.
Yeah, economicprinciples.org. He says you can find more detailed country health gauges there and even some model-based projections for economic growth over the next decade or so.
Okay, so wrapping up the next 5-10 years, what are the absolute key dynamics we should focus on, according to Dalio?
He boils it down to three main things to watch super closely. First, the regular short-term business cycle debt, money, the economy. Second, the internal political cycles within key countries, especially the U.S. And third, the trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship. Those conflicts and their level of interdependence or decoupling, those are the big drivers for the near term.
Right. This has been incredibly illuminating, really getting inside that framework. If you had to sum up the absolute core takeaway from all this.
I'd say it's that history really does offer a guide. It's not just random events. There are patterns, cycles, driven by understandable forces related to human nature and the pursuit of wealth and power. Understanding these patterns gives you a much better map for navigating what's happening now.
So for you listening, the idea is you now have a better grasp of these huge underlying forces shaping our world. You can hopefully see beyond just the day-to-day news cycle.
Exactly. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Dalio listed those 18 determinants: education, debt, leadership, conflict, etc. Thinking about the next 10 or 20 years, which one or two of those do you think will be the absolute most critical in shaping what happens next in this big cycle?
Yeah, and what signs, what indicators would you personally watch to track those specific factors? Something to really chew on.
Definitely.
And again, if you want to dive even deeper into the data and the principles behind this, check out economicprinciples.org.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's certainly a lot to think about regarding the changing world order.
It really is. Thanks for tuning in.